in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we're into show 37. And before we get started with today's show, I just want to apologize that there were some technical glitches, and so I was not able to download the previous show. At some point, I may be able to recapture, I have the clips and all that kind of stuff, but I just want to let you know that unfortunately, I was not able to get that recording off of the server here at the studio. So hopefully we don't have those glitches today, but I can tell you I am navigating around having a computer down. So we have a computer down, and so I'm working with a little bit different format today, but I do have all of the clips already uploaded for today's show. It's just a little different feel and flow in the station for me, but I think all is well. I do want to welcome you to the show, and hopefully your week has been going well through the looking at everything through the lens of race reconciliation. And that's kind of the world that I live in, is trying to really figure out how we can adjust and take a look at how our world looks differently when we look at it through the lens of race reconciliation. So what I wanted to do today, and before I get started, remember the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. Once again, welcome to the One Human Nation Show, and I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. So one of the things that happened on the last show, I wanted to give you some follow-up information. As you recall, this was a show that featured several clips from Michelle Alexander, the author of the book, The New Jim Crow. And there was a specific incident that she was involved with that happened during the 90s and came to, I guess, full fruition in 2000 that kind of changed how her reconciliation journey shifted. And it was in reference to the purposeful planting of information that was not correct. And there was like 119 youth in West Oakland that were pretty much terrorized and were falsely accused and, wound up with felony records. So I wanted to give you some follow-up information, and you can Google this information out of, I think they refer to them as the Oakland Riders information. And what came out of that, and I just want to, start out by saying that I have extreme respect for law enforcement. I think that is one of the most stressful positions to be into day in and day out, to pretty much put your life in your hands as you go out and handle situations that come up in the communities that you serve. And I definitely appreciate that. And I want to emphasize, when I researched this information that happened, it was only 4 police officers that were involved. They were part of an elite group that was, out there, pretty much had gone rogue. And fast forwarded to up-to-date information to see what happened, there was never any convictions for those officers. You can read about follow-up information as far as what happened to the rookie officer who was the whistleblower, and basically how that kind of changed his involvement, and how he looked at being involved with law enforcement. The city settled with the youth, but there was never any convictions of the officers involved. And I think there's one that's still at large somewhere. He kind of, as far as I know, he he left the country. But others basically are in different areas doing different things, but never convicted. And doesn't seem to be much that's changed as far as some of the recommendations, because of course this all came under federal investigation. And so I thought, well, surely this part of the country, this has had some impact in how things are different. And part of what came out of that was that as of most recently, there was an LA County Sheriff's deputy that was charged with selling drugs and offering to hire other cops to protect dealers. So there was this other scandal that broke recently as of January of 2018. So, and corruption happens anywhere, which is what we're going to focus on, not necessarily corruption in Savannah, but some of the local issues that are going on that I would really encourage you to take a look at through the lens of reconciliation, race reconciliation, and why that's so important. There are going to be 3 topics I'm going to talk to you about before we get to the break point, and then that's when we're going to get into some of the clips that are going to be answering the question, which is a curiosity to me: why would someone confess to a crime that they did not commit? And if you're like me, you may watch a lot of law enforcement shows, and you kind of see the interrogation room and everything that happens, and there's a side of you that says, well, that would never happen. I would never I would never admit to a crime that I would not commit. Who does that? What's the profile of the person that does that? So there are some clips from someone that has expertise with cognitive issues, and they're a professor, and they have really broken down and studied this to a lot bigger, with a lot more expertise than what I can convey to you. So we're going to listen to a couple of those clips after I talk to you about some local issues that I hope you direct your attention to, because it definitely has an impact on how we really need to work towards race reconciliation in Savannah. So as you know, I moved back to Savannah in November of 2016. And from that time, I've just been really trying to get acclimated to the culture in Savannah, and enjoying being back in Savannah tremendously, and that has not changed. But that doesn't mean that we can walk around with blinders and think that everything is perfect. So there are 3 things that I want to bring to your attention, and hopefully you'll be curious to look at them closer. One is in reference to an affordable housing project development that was approved January 4th. Not the exact project, but what was approved was the selling of some land that the city of Savannah owned. And this particular project is around the area of Westgate Boulevard. I don't have all of the specifics on it. You can definitely, let me see if I can give you a little bit more an idea of where this is. It's 276 unit projects that is specifically for affordable housing. So there are only going to be 6 units in this project that are going to be higher income or median, a middle income. The other income level is at 60% or below. Most cities that are dealing with workforce housing issues and really how to house people that have lower incomes, it's kind of now a best practice that you don't put all of your working force housing that's in a particular lower income bracket all together. So this rent is going to be subsidized, and it was all done with the blessing of the Housing Authority here in Savannah, which is a whole nother issue. So get a picture of this. All but 6 of the units will be low-income, tax credit supported units designated for families with an income at 60% or below median income that's set by HUD. And that number, that annual income number, comes out to be $39,000. So, of course, you typically have people supporting, their families. And so the rent's going to be subsidized, coming out to an amount of $736 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment. So the big rush on getting the city to sell an unused section of Westgate Boulevard. This complex is going to be developed on the northwest corner of Highway 204 and the Interstate 95 intersection. It's in an area that was remained undeveloped, and it was annexed into the city of Savannah, from what I'm reading here, more than a decade ago. And so they needed to get this right-of-way for this unused section of West Gateway Boulevard for the project. And this was the push that I was watching on the city council meeting and the work session on January 4th. And the information they presented is they just needed to get it done. They needed to get it done quickly. There was no renderings of any of what the development was going to look like. They couldn't. At one point, they said it was only going to be 2 stories, and then it comes out it's 3 stories, and so it just kind of went on and on. There were only 2 aldermen that did not vote to approve the sale of this particular right-of-way that was needed. So it was a 7-2 vote. It was recently brought to my attention by the alderman that voted against, one of the aldermen that voted against this, which was one of his questions was, you're putting people that are coming into the city of Savannah, typically using mass transit, the bus service to get back and forth, or they're going to have, are they going to have access to these type of services, or they're going to be able to access, grocery stores and just getting, commuting back and forth to work. And it turns out that no, none of that's being provided. And so it's like, okay, so you're going to build this complex that you're going to be housing people that are not going to have the ability, to always have a working vehicle, working car, if they do have a working car. And it goes into detail, the response that I read, as far as the dangerous situation, because there's not even a sidewalk that, and where it's situated, it's bad. Let me just say it's bad. So what you want to Google, if you want to research this some more, is workforce housing coming to Savannah's south side, and just, take a look at that and see how the votes were. Take a little, especially the ones that the 2 councilmen, the aldermen that opposed it for good reason. And it turns out their concerns, especially for one of them, is well grounded. It's going to be a problem. So this what's going to be built is pretty much going to be a future slum area. I don't know any other way to say it. And if we're going to get to reconciliation and social equity and justice in this community, we really have to take a very close look at what's coming into our city. This particular developer is out of Dallas, and the name of it is Atlantic Housing Foundation. So if you Google Atlantic Housing Foundation Dallas, their website's going to come up, and you can take a look at some of their projects, and you can determine for yourself, is this going to be a good thing for the city of Savannah, or it's going to be a bad thing, and how to get engaged earlier in the process so that we don't continue to segregate people by economics. When you read any book on how to improve yourself in your economic situation, the first thing that it talks about typically is, if you want to be successful, surround yourself with successful people, and people that typically are successful probably will have a higher income level, and that's just not going to be happening in this particular project. There could be others, and I'm just not aware of them, but this particular one came to my attention. So if you are, concerned about that, if you have an interest in that, if you're curious about that, do some research, learn more about it, because it's going to continue to happen. And this is where we need to take action. So that's one item that came to my attention that, kind of is a red flag when you start looking through the lens of reconciliation. The second thing is the work session from Savannah City Council that occurred on January 18th. And I love it because you can go back and see the work sessions at different times. They publish them as well as the actual city council meeting, but it's the actual work sessions, and I've said this before, that you really get a very good look into the culture that exists with the leadership in the city of Savannah. And there's some key positions besides the city council and the mayor, and one of them is the chief of police. So hopefully you've been keeping up to date to know that the chief of police recently resigned, effective January 22nd, and that would have been Chief Lumpkin. He's moving, I think, to an area closer to where his family is. And he's been there for 3 years. And one of the things that he has fought for and accomplished was bringing in a different culture to the Savannah Police Department that really looks at policing neighborhoods in a different way, to really look at the folks that are the high offenders that are already known. And it's a specific culture that he's brought into play, as well as the emphasis on why technology is needed to kind of make things very transparent between the police officers and the community. Well, he resigned January 22nd. There's an interim police chief who cannot be hired for the permanent position, and it's the police chief that just resigned from Pooler. So his first day on the job was January 23rd, and as you know, there was already kind of an incident that happened on January 23rd. I'll let you research that, but I want to give you some idea that there's some things going on with our law enforcement in the city of Savannah that we need to be aware of. And in addition to that, keep in mind that the merger between Chatham County and the Savannah Police Department did not happen. And effective February 1, it's the official separation. And there are some gaps. Chatham County is having, to reach out to the Sheriff's Department to fill in the gaps of where they're not going to have law enforcement officers to fill in. So one of the things that came through as I was watching this work session and reading between the lines and some things that were actually said, there is kind of a morale issue, which why wouldn't there be, right? I mean, it's a tough job, and in looking at retention, so as well as balancing the transparency with the community. So that's kind of some background information to bring us to one of the items discussed in this work session from January 18th was how to reduce criminal penalties for possession of marijuana. And it was something proposed by one of the council members, and it was supported by the previous police chief of Savannah. And I heard him speak at a totally different event. And one of the things that he said in reference to a question that he was asked, when there's an incident that happens, what is his process that he goes through? And one of the things he said that I had not heard any law enforcement say before, not to say that it hasn't happened, I just hadn't heard it. And he said, what I look at is I examine the heart of that officer that's involved in whatever's happened. Because if their heart is not in the right place, there's no amount of training in the world that's going to correct that situation. That was very key to hear that from someone that's the chief of police, and that's the culture that he was bringing into the Savannah Police Department. So one of the things that is their proposal as an ordinance is to decriminalize the possession of marijuana for less than 1 ounce. Now, keep in mind, this is only for the city of Savannah. It is not about legalizing possession of marijuana because state law prohibits that. The reason I want you to watch this city council work session is to watch the difference in attitude between the exiting chief of police, Lumpkin, and the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department made it very clear that they're going to continue to go by state law, that they don't care about what options that the city of Savannah is giving that police officer to make some decisions. If somebody was a first offender, instead of immediately putting him to the criminal system, they would have this option. In other words, it's just another tool for the tool belt, so to speak. Well, what was interesting to me looking at this through the lens of race reconciliation, it was very clear that there was a totally different attitude in the approach. And I'm not going to go into details in it. I will encourage you to take a look at that work session from January 18th from Savannah City Council. The other part about this, because this was a session on public safety, was just to look at the dynamics between some of the questions council members were asking the different law enforcement departments as far as training and community engagement. And it was very clear to me that there's a disconnect between what these individual law enforcement officers are required to do and the hope that what they will do for community engagement. There's a disconnect because their ability to keep their jobs as well as get promoted is performance-based, based on, how many, tickets are you issuing, and how many cases are you there's a disconnect, because if you're spending time in the community and really getting to know the community and getting out of your police car and walking around and getting to know the kids in the community, in some ways it's taking away from your performance, right? Because you're not out there policing, because you're getting to know the community. And there were several city council members that really was trying to get this point across that, community engagement right now is just critical because of the level of distrust that exists between, what's been the pattern or things that have been happening in the city of Savannah and what's going to be the impact now that there's going to be a transition with the change in the police chief, which is a very critical position for what that culture is going to be like in that police department. So the city manager, of course, they're going to do a nationwide search and also look and see if there's, internal as far as promotion. But the interim person cannot be appointed for this position. It is specifically done that way so they can try to get someone in or fill that position from someone that would not create any more or any conflict. So that's two things, which is huge because it's impacting one of the critical issues that Savannah residents identified as far as public safety, so it is a recognition that there's going to be some transition taking place, and it's really important that you engage and take a look and see what's really happening with the city and the decisions that are being made. The third thing is not necessarily something that's connected with the city of Savannah, but it's in reference to some information that I received yesterday in attending this presentation at the Beach Institute, and it was about this examination of plantation tourism in South Carolina, and it was presented by Dr. Amy Potter. And it's this study to take a look at this industry through the lens of race, ethnicity, and social equity in tourism. And one of the things that this presentation presented was how some of the plantations, especially these are, your bigger plantations, really, it's kind of the gone with the wind type of what's portrayed. And the study that was done, as well as they have a survey and just getting feedback from the people that attended, it really kind of brought to light that people would be okay with receiving more historical truth about the actual lifestyle of the slaves on the plantation. And typically, if they were visiting the plantation, they were also doing something else to get a better understanding of a historical perspective. So this particular report that's out there and that the survey information that's being shared with this plantation is with the hope that they will change how they are conveying information, in that it will not impact their business and their livelihood, because some of them, they really promote the beauty of their grounds and their gardens, and they perform weddings and have other events there. And what was reassuring to me or hopeful for me was just getting the feedback from those surveys and that information that people really want the truth. There's a shift, because at this stage there are more people, and I think there are more and more people that just tell me the truth of what happened. Because as an African American, if I go on one of these plantation tours and they're not talking about the slavery side of the equation, it's typically not a place that I'm going to feel comfortable. It's not going to be, and that was also something that was mentioned as part of this talk. Again, if you want to look up some of this information, you can Google Dr. Amy Potter, plantation tourism. And, it's interesting how they're trying to, because what would be more ideal than to get the plantations to actually include more of an education component, as well as provide the entertainment. And so I think that's going to be, kind of critical as we move forward in this country into looking at how we can become one human nation, and using these places of tourism to be more of education. And they have a term that Dr. Potter mentioned, and it's called edutainment. that it's also an edutainment complex. Her words, I guess this is something new that they're coming up with, to incorporate education as well as entertainment. And I think that would be awesome. I think the more we can have these places of intersection where we learn the truth and we can look at things through the lens of honesty and being open, and being safe. I mean, that's the whole point, is so that people can really have an experience to learn more about our history, not Black history, white history, Indigenous people history, Asian people, our history. So believe it or not, we are 30 minutes into the show, so I do want to take a couple of breaks, and then we're going to get into the second part of the show that's really going to get into answering the question of, why do people admit to a crime that they did not commit? You're listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. Clean Coast is a volunteer organization which works to combat marine debris by holding monthly beach and march cleanups along the Georgia coast. If you would like to find out more or volunteer, you may visit cleancoast.org. If you enjoy our programming on WRUULP, please support the station with a donation. As an individual, you can give any amount, become a basic station member, or become a serious fan of the station. To check out membership rates and to donate to the station, go to www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Again, to donate to the station, go to www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUU-LP. So if you're just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. And so we are going to transition into a topic that fascinates me. And maybe it's because I love watching law enforcement shows and this whole, process of how people confess to crimes. And I happen to find this information. I just love TED Talks. You can find a lot of information from people that are very more educated in this topic than I could ever be. But if you ever have dealt with someone with cognitive issues or thinking through how the brain works, it's pretty fascinating to see how this whole prospect or this whole aspect of how we channel information and how we respond to different situations. So the couple of clips we're going to listen to are from Nancy Franklin. So if you are a YouTuber, if you're a TED Talks person, if you Google Nancy Franklin, I'm sure the YouTube video will come up. So let's take a listen at this first clip from Nancy Franklin talking about this issue of why do people that are innocent confess to crimes that they did not commit.
Imagine you did something really bad. Justice served might involve you confessing and taking responsibility and feeling the consequences of what you've done, right? Imagine instead that you didn't do something bad. Everything else is the same. Should you confess? Of course not, right? But would you confess? Hold that thought. Let's talk about the criminal justice system. Because the justice system is designed so that you actually can say that you committed a crime. And that may be appealing to some people. So for example, if you are guilty and you know the evidence against you is overwhelming and you want to strike a deal, then you might plead guilty. In fact, about 95% of cases in the US end in a plea. And you can imagine how choked the courts would be if every one of those cases had to go to trial. So you might be thinking, wow, 95%, we must be mostly perfect, right? About 50 years of psychological research offers a very different world of explanation. So you may know something about the wrongful conviction cases that have been emerging over the past decades. About 3/4 of those have involved eyewitnesses incorrectly identifying what turns out to be an innocent suspect. And there are other common contributors to wrongful conviction. I'm here to talk about one in particular, false confession or coerced confession. So I want you to think about the possibility that in many cases it's actually not the actual perpetrator who's in prison, but someone who amounts to another innocent victim, right? That's an awful prospect for a civilized society to have to, bear the weight of. And the moral costs are added to by the financial costs, about $60,000 a year to incarcerate an inmate. Public assistance maybe for a family who's lost a wage earner, maybe millions of dollars if this leads to an exoneration and a lawsuit that might follow. But, why would somebody confess to, let's say, a murder that they didn't commit? It just seems preposterous, right? Well, let's go into the interrogation room and see how this might unfold. So once you are in the interrogation room, you actually are presumed guilty. And it's the job of the interrogator to elicit a confession from you. There are methods for that because the presumption is that whoever is in that interrogation room is not going to be forthcoming with a confession. So there are methods, and they include things like get in the person's face and don't let them off the hook. Don't entertain their denials. Urge them to think about the consequences of continuing to not cooperate. And remember, this is you. You found yourself in this interrogation room. You don't know how it happened. You're facing this barrage of questions and accusations. Meanwhile, this room is actually quite stressful simply to be in. You're isolated. You may be held for hours on end, and in fact, in false confession cases, that turns out to be more than 16 hours on average on end. You may have to go to the bathroom, you may be hungry. And then let's add one more layer on top of that. The police are actually allowed to bluff about the evidence that they have against you. So they may come in and say, we have your fingerprints at the scene, we have eyewitnesses who've named you or who've identified you, there's surveillance video, you failed the polygraph test. For you, this is a nightmare, right? You don't know how this could have happened, but here you are and they're saying that they have all this evidence. And so you might find yourself sort of weighing two possibilities. You know, roll the dice, go to court, maybe the jurors will believe them, find you guilty, maybe you'll get life, maybe worse. Or, you know, maybe cut your losses in this horrible predicament you find yourself in. Maybe you can get a better, more merciful sentence, something, you know, and you're weighing these two possibilities. It may turn out to be a rational decision, to choose to make a false confession in a case like that. But you all are TED people, right? So, you know better than that. You're well educated, you got good coping skills. You know, maybe you wouldn't fall prey to those tactics, but you know what? You probably wouldn't be likely to be in that interrogation room in the first place. So this is hypothetical for you. Let's talk about people it's not hypothetical for. Minorities, people who live in low-income areas, people who are non-native English speakers. You can imagine what an interrogation is like for them, right? Illegal immigrants who are facing the prospect of being deported if they don't cooperate. People who have members of their family or social circle who are known to police, or people who have their own criminal record even, but who didn't do this. You can imagine anybody in any of those categories being frightened, terrified to be in that interrogation room. And fear may lead to risk aversion, and risk aversion puts you at risk for making a false confession.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we're listening to some information from Nancy Franklin from a TED Talk that she did to talk about, why would someone confess to a crime that they did not commit? So we continue listening to this information from Nancy Franklin.
There are groups of people who are particularly susceptible to that, so I want to tell you about some of them. Let's start with intellectually impaired people. They are less likely to think about those long-term consequences. They are more deferential to authority figures. They're more easily led by questions or suggestions made by an interrogator, and you can imagine how those things might combine. Think about that. So the interrogator might ask, who shot the victim? And the intellectually impaired innocent suspect has no idea, but they want to be cooperative, and they think they may think that they need to guess, or that they're expected to, and so they do, not realizing that they're not only implicating the person they named, but they're implicating themselves. They're implying that they were there. Intellectually impaired people are actually overrepresented among the exonerated in false confession cases. And so, while you might be likely, or at least at risk, for making a false confession, don't kid yourselves. You're not actually who I'm most worried about. Let me tell you a couple other groups who I am very worried about. Let's talk about the mentally ill. So that interrogation room is stressful, it's isolating, it's awful for any of us, but even more so for mentally ill people who might also be dealing with other risk factors like delusions or impulsivity or poor judgment. Addicts. Imagine being in that stressful situation for hours on end while your withdrawal symptoms are getting worse and worse. Imagine trading years of your freedom so that you can get out of this room and go have a fix, which may be a cigarette. Imagine that it's an addiction that's the straw that breaks an innocent suspect. How about children? Children who are 1/3 of the false confession exoneration cases. Compared to adults, They're more deferential to authority figures. They're more emotionally volatile. They're poorer at risk perception. They are poorer at seeing the long-term consequences of their actions, which makes them very vulnerable. And in fact, you know, armed with that knowledge, you can see why it's easy to see cases like all 5 innocent suspects in the Central Park 5 case, which you may be familiar with, all of them adolescents, falsely confessing to that brutal attack. Anyone else? Yeah. People who believe in the criminal justice system. You know, that may have been you. So here you are in the interrogation room, and you know it's a mistake, and you're sure that they're going to discover it's a mistake. They'll find that evidence that exonerates you and implicates someone else. And so you, as an innocent suspect, may innocently sign a confession, expecting that that evidence is going to come save you when it's not necessarily there. And remember I said before that the police can bluff about the evidence against you. Imagine this happening. The police come in and say, we found the murder weapon, we've sent it to the lab, we're gonna, get the DNA off of it. That may be a great bluff for a guilty suspect. It may lead them to confess. You're thinking, they found the weapon, they found the DNA, yay, right? So what I can do is go ahead and confess. I can get out of this room. They'll find out who the real perpetrator is. It'll be fine. There may not be that gun, or they may get a DNA hit on someone else, and then they may decide that there were multiple perpetrators, and you're not off the hook. Your attorney, of course, is going to want to have protected you against all of this and had you not signed the confession in the first place. But you, as an innocent suspect who believes in the criminal justice system, you are likely to have waived your right to counsel and your right to silence. You are likely to have provided a very detailed alibi, explaining where you really were that day, not realizing that any discrepancy in details can be used to show that you're a liar.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. We are continuing our conversations this month, actually, in looking at the criminal justice system and this particular area that we're gaining some more insight. Who are the vulnerable people that would more likely confess to a crime that they cannot that they did not commit. What goes on in that process. If you listen to the beginning of the hour, we talked a little bit about locally for the city of Savannah, some things were going on in the law enforcement world, some of the transition areas that are happening, and really looking at this whole performance issue. If you work a regular job, you have performance issues and things that you need to show that you're getting done in order for you to show that you're doing your job. I don't want to in any way belittle the fact that being in law enforcement, I think, is one of the hardest jobs out there. And I have utmost respect for the people that are really doing the best that they can do within the system that we have. The whole point of looking at through the lens of race reconciliation to get to social justice, to get through truth and healing, what do we need to do to make some adjustments in our system? What are some things that we can do to have a different outcome? So this final clip that we're going to listen to really gives us just some answers from the talk that Nancy Franklin did on a TED Talk to give us, what are some options? What are some things that we can do to minimize, if not eliminate, someone being put in that position, feeling like, my best option is just to go on and confess so I can get out of this interrogation room.
And what you're facing now likely is more serious charges and more numerous charges against you. The opportunity that you may have for a favorable plea deal is now eroded because they have a stronger case against you. And then there's more sort of avalanching consequences of this. Your attorney may not work as hard as she otherwise would have, given that you've made this confession. And there is evidence for this in the exoneration cases. Eyewitnesses who find out that you've confessed are more likely to testify against you. Your own alibi witnesses who find out that you've confessed are less likely to testify for you. Forensic analysts who, are looking, let's say, to match the fingerprint at the scene to whoever did it, once they find out that you've confessed, are more likely to make that false match to you. There's more. So think about jurors and judges who, when they see that you've retracted your confession, might consider that a shameless act of a horrible criminal. And it may be in part due to that judges are more likely to mete out harsher sentences in cases of false confession. And you certainly can't blame jurors who have been exposed only to that last moment of your interrogation, right? When the camera is finally turned on, and there you are talking in great detail with flat emotion about this horrible crime that you committed. The jurors don't get to see the hours of you protesting your innocence. They don't get to see the intimidating circumstances. They don't get to see all of the times that you had to go through those details before you got them down pat. And let's talk about those details. It turns out that in almost every single rape or murder false confession case, that confession had included details that only the perpetrator and the police would have known. How do you know about it? Because it came out during questions and during accusations throughout the interrogation. So they get woven into your confession, and you can imagine how damning that is when a juror hears those details coming out of your own mouth. So somehow, thankfully, we actually do have hundreds of exoneration cases involving false confessions. I don't want you thinking about those hundreds, though. I want you thinking about the likely tens of thousands of people currently in prison who've fallen prey to this. I want you to think about, as you're walking down the street, it could happen to him, and maybe the homeless guy who lives on the corner. We don't want any of these people going to prison for a murder that they didn't commit, and we certainly don't want to run into the actual perpetrator who went free because these guys went to prison. So here's what we know. This happens. People do confess to crimes that they didn't commit, even murder, and often in 1 in 4 of exoneration cases. That's why we need to know about this, because it's so prevalent and it's so perplexing. It's not a matter of, a few bad cops taking people into the back room and slapping them around until they make a confession. It's actually much more scary than that. This can happen in a justice system that consists of nothing but good people who want to do well, people who trust the system and each other and themselves. And so we need to be very clear that meaning well here is not the same as doing well. We can make improvements, and that's where psychological research comes in. We can identify where the problems are. That can help us understand the underlying causes and can lead us to implement.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we are getting information from Nancy Franklin on really looking at this cognitive issue of people confessing to crimes that they did not commit, and how do we improve the system? How do we improve the interrogation process? So take a listen as we listen to this last clip as we come close to finishing up today's show.
So first, you may have thought about this already, videotape the whole interrogation. It's easy, it's not expensive, and it allows the judge and the jurors to look for potentially coercive circumstances, to see how a suspect's story changes over time, and to be able to evaluate the confession inside of a meaningful context. Second, train interrogators in more effective methods, both of eliciting information from guilty suspects and protecting innocent suspects. Here's one way that we know works. The interrogator walks into the room and says, "You don't know what I know. I'm going to ask you questions, and I'm going to listen for what I know to be the right answers. I'm going to listen for complete answers. And if I ever see you lying to me or not telling me everything that I know you know, then we're done, and the possibility of me helping you is over. And remember, you don't know what I know. Let's begin. Right? So it's a more effective way of bluffing, and it's a great way to incentivize the guilty person to actually tell what they know, and it adds some protections against risks that we've talked about for innocent suspects. Here's what I know as a cognitive psychologist. Errors are woven into the fabric of being human. Perception, memory, judgment, interpersonal dynamics, there's problems all over the place, but they're predictable and systematic. They're predictable and systematic. And even though they feed on each other and magnify each other, if we know what they are, we can look for them. We can implement policies that are designed to anticipate them and counteract them. We have a criminal justice system that depends very, very heavily on humans. So what we know is that there are errors woven into that fabric as well. We can make this system better. We know how to do it in many, many different kinds of ways. We must do it as possible victims, as possible suspects, as members of a civilized society. It's in all of our best interest to make sure that the actual perpetrator goes to prison and no one else. It's the best measure of justice that I know of.
So you've been listening to Nancy Franklin. She's a cognitive psychologist and sharing information with us of why would people confess to a crime that they did not commit. So, this is a very complex issue, and it's not something that we have easy solutions to, but there are solutions, and it sounds like there are solutions that are being implemented. So I'm encouraged about that. So as we wrap up today's show, I do want to remind you that we do have a podcast now for the One Human Nation show. You can pick up the podcast on iTunes or by going to the One Human Nation website, and that's onehumannation.info. And hopefully with the podcast that we should be able to upload from today's show, this is where you can also make some comments that we can respond to as we continue to go through this journey of race reconciliation, and what does it mean for us to become one human nation. I think these conversations are important, and creating the space for these conversations are important. And as you get ready to prepare for your next week, I hope you keep this in mind and continue forward on your journey. Next up is Sound Limit with Troy Stoner. I hope everyone has a wonderful week, and I'm just ecstatic that things are getting a little bit warmer, and I'm looking forward to continuing the race reconciliation journey on the One Human Nation show.